Hello, everybody, and welcome to LTUE's Book Club. This time around, we are discussing The Crystal Shard by R.A. Salvatore. If you haven't heard about this book, I am surprised because it's been around for over 40 years. But I'm going to give you a quick synopsis off the back, and then I'm going to ask my panelists to introduce themselves, and I'll do my same for myself. But I'm going to throw out a question to them to think about, to answer, and that is, this book here, something in it probably was impactful to you, either the way the story was written or how it affects what you do as a writer, a gamer, whatever it is that you do professionally. And I want to ask, what was that item and how did it kind of hit? So, like they say here, with his days in the Underdark far behind him, Drow Ranger Dritz de Erden sets down roots in the windswept 10 towns of Icewind Dale, a cold and unforgiving place. 10 towns sits on the brink of a catastrophic war threatened by the barbarian tribes of the north. In the midst of battle, a young barbarian named Wolfgar is captured and made the ward of Brunner, a grizzled dwarf leader and companion to Dritz. Dritz's help, Wolfgar will grow from a feral child to a man with the heart of a dwarf, the instincts of a warrior, and the soul of a hero. But it will take even more to defeat the corrupt wizard who wields the demonic power of Kreshenbon, the Crystal Shard. So there's a lot going on in there. So introducing myself, I am Dan Yoakum. In terms of LTUE, I am the track director for the gaming track. So I was asked to kind of present this because this is a book that kicked off second edition D&D in 1988. It was a lead-in for all of that. And I always found it interesting because out of this book, the thing that I found very impactful was that it wasn't written about Dritz. This story was started to be a Conan the Barbarian ripoff about Wolfgar. And it changed drastically and went from there. And we're going to talk further on of some of those things that it impacted. So now I'm going to kind of go around my screen and ask people, and we'll start with Aaron. Please tell us about yourself and what was something impactful about this book for you?
Hey guys, so I'm Aaron N. Hall. I am the author of The Legend of which is a fantasy comedy that was inspired by Dungeons and Dragons, and I've written a handful of other books. But the thing that was most impactful for me with The Crystal Shard, and it's kind of hard to gamify as a writer, but I feel like this book struck an impeccable tone with high fantasy. Like as I was reading this just felt like classic pinnacle high fantasy with Salvatore's voice and the way that he described the setting. It just felt epic and huge, and that's something that I really appreciated about the book.
Okay, let's move on to Chris.
Hey everyone, so my name's Chris Lecluse. I'm an English professor from Westminster University in Salt Lake City, and I've been playing D&D since the Red Box Basic set. And not to divulge my age too clearly, but I am the target audience for the Crystal Shard. I would have been 15 when it came out in 1988, although I did not read it as a teenager. I've got a book coming out hopefully by the end of the year called Race and Monstrosity in Dungeons and Dragons that is going to be coming out from McFarland Press. And tying into that, I think one of the things I think about in reading this book is how people go to fantasy to define themselves, especially if we think about a sort of stereotypical audience for this book of adolescent boys, and how reading this book might feed into their own kind of self-concept.
So as we move down my list, it's got it in alphabetical, so we know how it's kind of going. So Mari, tell us about yourself and what you think.
Hi, my name is Maddie Murdoch, and I am a professional dungeon master working for Dungeon Master Direct, but I am also a professional writer who has specialized writing freelance in the tabletop gaming industry. And so I have written tie-in fiction. And so the interesting thing that kind of stood out to me as I was reading this was in the acknowledgments, Salvatore makes a very, I would say, humble acknowledgement that they were he was a beginning writer and the editor took a chance on him, and that is how he got into this whole thing and started writing these novels, and he's very appreciative of that. And that just reminded me about 13 years ago when I was setting out as a freelance writer in the tabletop gaming industry trying to get my first gig, and somebody took a chance on me, and I was like, wow, I was totally in the same spot as he was, and that felt really cool to have that like connection there, because I was like, we all start somewhere when someone gives us a chance in the industry.
And that takes us down to Zach.
Yeah, hi. I'm ZSD Monty or Zach. I get called Z and Zed by the internationals, but everybody can call me Zach. ZSD Monty. I'm the author of Guard in the Garden, which is a brand new cozy fantasy about a veteran's healing journey, all about a dwarven warrior who gets injured and has to figure out who he is now that he can't be a warrior anymore. And so get a lot of people who absolutely love D&D and come to my books and go, oh my gosh, this feels like what I remember D&D books feeling like. And before I wrote Garden in the Garden, I wrote a whole trilogy of very old school, very classic style epic fantasy adventure. So this is so in my wheelhouse. The Icewind Dale trilogy. This is my actual copy. This is the first copy that I actually read of the Crystal Shard, and it has seen a lot of better days. I loaned it out too many times, and it doesn't get loaned out anymore because I don't know if it'll come back in more than 2 pieces like it did last time. So, but no, for me, a big thing was the Crystal Shard was a book that I didn't even read until maybe, gosh, I don't know, 7, 8 years ago when I was starting to write my own books. And it just gave me so much encouragement because I read the Crystal Shard and I was like, I was reading all these lore heavy fantasy books and I wanted to get to the adventure. And this one just gave me so much encouragement to just keep doing what I was doing. And of course, here we are today.
Okay, now as we move forward on these questions, I'm just going to throw them out because I can tell between all of us here, we have very different experiences, very different backgrounds, areas of specialty. So if we come across something you feel like, yep, I've got something to say on that, just go ahead and jump on in. So one of the things that we were kind of bringing up with earlier discussion was, and it's been brought up here, this is tie-in fantasy to a game. Tie-in work comes in from all sorts of things, gaming, movies, music, all sorts of different levels. So as tie-in fiction, how do you feel this book works and how did it maybe influence some of the things that you've been working on?
I think I can speak to that. My first foray into tie-in fiction as a consumer was when I was about 12 years old. I read this novelization of a game called Legend of the Five Rings. And this was very much because I found it at Borders bookstore. I loved the cover. I bought it and I read all of the books and thought it was amazing. I had no idea that there was a game associated with the novels at all until I was an adult, like much later. And I realized that that's kind of the purpose of tie-in fiction. It's to essentially grab more of a demographic than the initial like product of the IP is intended for. Obviously, Dungeons and Dragons is an IP that, back in the day, I think was exclusively meant for children, boy children, right? And then maybe people that were fans of fantasy. But when you get a product in a bookstore, you're actually parading the IP in front of many other types of people, that definitely people who would never go into a gaming store and don't know anything about gaming. And so I feel like as a piece of tie-in fiction, this is an excellent I would say example, because it does a really good job of capturing what cool elements D&D has with being very accessible as a fantasy novel. So people who maybe have nothing to do with gaming would still find it a very interesting entryway into the lore of the universe.
Yeah, something I was thinking about too, or kind of, so that's a great explanation of sort of the market-driven, uses of tie-in fiction, right? I'm also interested in thinking like, what are the personal uses of tie-in fiction? Like, what does this do for readers? One thing that struck me is in 1988, right, when this came out, before the interwebs, if you were a lone D&D player, and then as now, it can be often difficult to find other people to play with or get everybody's schedules to coordinate. Actually, if anything, it's much easier now, right, than it was then. Could reading a book like this give you that sense of community? right? Like give you that gaming experience that you might not be able to have, around a table. Mhm.
Yeah, I love that. That's great. I mean, it's interesting to think about uh, the kind of lore and everything that had to be packaged into this book. And I know just recently I released it's a twisted right, and it's one back, and you're like, oh my gosh, there's so much Greek mythology there's so much other things that you could incorporate, and there's so many different avenues and there's so many things that uh but if I do this, will it make everybody mad? Or if I do this, will I make everybody mad? Because you're trying to balance this. Okay, I got to stay true to what everybody is hoping for from this mythology or from this world, and but also create a story that's going to work and that's going to be fun for people to read, right? And I it's hard to imagine I mean, it's a good thing he had good editors, right? Because it's hard to imagine what he was feeling going into this book is like his first book, like his first real thing. And he's like, oh my gosh, okay, let's do this. So, I mean, gosh, what a challenge it had to be.
I think the reason people kind of gravitate to this extended universe stuff, I actually did some research on this in college. I did some research on the perception and reception of superhero remakes, sequels, and prequels in movies, because the Marvel Cinematic Universe kind of blew up over the last like 15, 20 years. And in the research, I found that people like stuff that's connected to other stuff. So if you like Dungeons and Dragons, I mean,
Right.
you want to be in that world and other avenues. I mean, playing the game by itself is great, but if you have the opportunity to see movies or read books, or I'm sure even if there's like epic music that can go along with it, I mean, becoming a more integrated part of that world just really appeals to people. So, I mean, that's where these books come in.
And if I could add to that too, I think the thing about D&D in particular is it's always been a mashup, right? Like according to lore, one of the first gestures towards the invention of fantasy role-playing games was when some guy doing a tabletop medieval war game took a druid and gave them a phaser from Star Trek. Okay, so 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 so, so it's never been this pure, genre, like we're just doing high fantasy here. And I think people have always, this goes back 1983. A guy named Gary Allen Fine wrote a book called Shared Fantasy, which analyzed role-playing games as from a social science perspective. It's amazing. This is D&D. He did this work in 78, 79. D&D was only like 5 years old. And he's studying what do D&D players like? How do they build community? And one of the things he found is D&D players, and we can extend this to role-playing game players in general, like to make sense of their experience by drawing on other media, right? They like to mash up, and I found that in talking with people who play D&D. They'll make sense of their own character by talking about Miles Morales as Spider-Man, right? Or casting controversies in The Little Mermaid. So it's never just, sorry, we're just focusing on this one genre, right?
Mhm.
We kind of touched on here some of the different purposes of tie-in fiction. So let's kind of take it to a step further, since that either directly or indirectly, everybody here has written tie-in fiction. What are some of the personal benefits as a writer to pursue writing tie-in?
If I
Either
could
as for a general market, a big producer, or as fan fiction.
I mean, if I could throw my hat in the ring, when I was writing The Legend of I guess it's kind of almost glorified fan fiction. It's not in the Forgotten Realms. It's not like official D&D stuff. But I'll tell you guys, as I was writing that book, I treated the player's handbook like my Bible. If the heroes were in a town and they needed to buy supplies, I was like, okay, how much does a length of rope cost? Like, how much would an axe cost? And that was my reference. So, and even when I have this guy who comes along who's a ranger. Okay, well, like, what are the stereotypical stuff that a ranger knows how to do? I was flipping through that pages. I had like my player's handbook on my desk with like bookmarks in it all over the place, so I could reference to make sure my story would be grounded in something that the readers were already familiar with, and something that's been tested and tried and true over years, to make sense within this world. So for me, that was incredibly helpful.
Yeah, totally. It's like it's you don't have to recreate the wheel, right? You don't have to start from the ground up. You have a foundation when you're working with a tie-in. Again, like I wrote the Hercules horror book, and it was like, okay, let me go back and read all this different, mythology just to kind of reintegrate myself and settle myself with the foundation. And once you have the foundation, you're like, okay, now we can run with this. And it's so much easier to write when the foundation's already laid out.
Mm.
I think maybe from more of a career perspective, writing tie-in fiction, at least for me, was essentially my foot in the door in an industry that I was hoping to break into, because often companies are looking for people that they can kind of pay cheaply to produce more product for the IP. And so oftentimes you will see novelists who have tie-in fiction on their bibliography because they were hired to be able to produce a product. They got a special, I would say, invitation to work with the product, and then therefore were able to kind of cut their teeth on publishing in an industry by starting out this way. And I feel like that was a really excellent thing, because you're kind of handheld through the entire process, because you're not writing it from like, as you said, like from scratch. You're not reinventing the wheel, but you also have editors that are very specifically trying to protect the integrity of the IP, and so they're giving you a lot of insight into like what the characters should look like or do, or how the plot should be. And you submit pitches and things like that, and they give you a lot of feedback, because they're trying to create a product that does feel like it matches their brand. And so just from a learning perspective, I learned so much based on all of the tie-in fiction that I wrote over my career, just because I had so much input into the writing process, and I was handheld through the entire thing, and I learned so much about the industry. And then after the end, I got great publishing credits for it. And so for me, it was an excellent way to break into an industry that I really wanted to get into. I didn't ever intend to. Like, I went to school very specifically hoping to become a novelist. Like, I was a English major, creative writing minor, hoping to, like, eventually publish my own stuff. But I got into gaming writing, and I've been doing that for a long time now, and it's been awesome.
It's so cool.
It does make me wonder too, and I don't know, and some of our viewers may know better, or Daniel, you may know as well. I'm curious what kind of access Salvatore was given, because as Daniel mentioned, this book came out to launch the second edition of D&D. It came out around the same time that Ed Greenwood sort of published a sort of compendium on the Forgotten Realms. And, and as I understand it, Icewind Dale is indicated in that book, but really not described in detail. And what strikes me is how much this tie-in fiction really contributed to the world building. And the same is true for the Dark Elf trilogy, which Salvatore wrote after the Icewind Dale trilogy. Like, he was given, a lot of freedom to create the lore, right? And then it got fed back into the game, so that now, people that may have never read his books just accept this as, to raise a problematic word, canon. So
Yeah, we're going to touch a little bit more on that in a while. But I have to kind of agree with like what Mari was saying, getting your foot in the door. This is a great way to do it. There are some major names out there that have gotten their start by writing novelizations for other intellectual properties. I know a big one is like Stackpole with BattleTech books. So if people are familiar with his work. So now we've talked about some of the advantages of writing in this type of environment. Let's flip it. What are some of the problems that are faced for writing in an intellectual property?
I mean,
I
who
see
wants
Mari
to
kind of
talk about
laughing.
it?
She's going, "Oh yeah."
Oh
Yeah,
yeah.
I want to hear what Mari has to say about this.
Sorry,
Yeah.
I wrote a novella called Whispers of Shadow and Steel, very specifically for the Legend of the Five Rings IP, and I went through so many pitches for the plot of that book. And I would say that the book certainly was written by me, but it is not a book that I feel like is mine in any way, because it was very clear from the very start that all of the ideas I had for the characters were wrong. All of the plot ideas I had were wrong. And so for me, it was a very interesting process because it was very clear that I was working with someone else's ideas, someone else's belongings. And so I think the major problem for me was that although it is a very creative process, like writing can be, some sort of art form where, you're looking to manifest some sort of interesting outlet for whatever cool ideas you have. I would say tie-in fiction is very specifically meant to sell the intellectual property product. And so your hands are very tied when it comes to a lot of the creative process. And so I would say sometimes, depending on what company you're working for, it is an awesome, very cool experience. But for other companies, I felt like it was also very difficult because it was almost like down to a T, a formula that I had to kind of guess at to get right. And then finally, once we figured out like what was okay, then that's when I could start actually working on the book. And that was a difficult process for me. So I would say one of the maybe not so good things about tie-in fiction is that you are responsible to the brand. And so you don't have a lot of freedom in your creative process.
Okay. Anybody else want to add to that?
Yeah, I can mention just my experience with the Hercules book is again, when it comes to lore, that's like, I mean, especially if we're talking about mythology, we're talking thousands of years of a legitimate, like, this is the story, right? Like, I mean, as far as deep lore goes, that's as deep as it goes, right? So, historical lore that you really have to. At a certain point, it was very difficult. I mean, I remember writing this book. It's like it's the shortest book, and it took me so stinking long to write it because I was just trying so hard to make sure I was staying true to everything, but then how much can I get away with in creative liberties? And that's a tough balance for sure.
Okay. So I'll kind of wrap it up on this one. I've had the opportunity of interviewing some people that have done work with intellectual properties in the movies and in books, for games and all sorts of different levels. And like what's been said here has always been one thing. Another aspect, if you're looking at going into this, is, if you ever hear in like television that they talk about a writer's room, there is a lot of the same feel a lot of times in these intellectual properties, that you will have someone that is basically a showrunner that says, these are our characters, just like was being mentioned. This is how we need to do it. And these are our timelines that this story can take place in. So there's also a lot of other aspects of the writing process that has to be brought in. I even talked to someone that they had to get out of it because their whole job was only writing outlines for other people to then write the stories. And they were like, I want to write these, but they were under contract to write the outlines. So there's all sorts of different aspects of what you can get into. So as we're writing these stories, and we already had Aaron kind of mentioned a little bit about how he used the book as a Bible. So what about writing the game mechanics into the story? How do you feel that plays a part? Is this something that you can just kind of, haze over, or is it something that really needs to be delved into so the story fits the game?
I don't know. I feel like the Dungeons and Dragons movie recently, Honor Among Thieves, I feel like really did a good job of showing us what the mechanics are probably looking like on screen, because there are definitely some moments in that movie where it's like, oh yeah, they just rolled a nat one. Like that's
Sure.
what could have went wrong. Absolutely went wrong. In the Crystal Shards case, I don't know, man. Everyone in this book was so badass. It's like, okay, you're rolling 18s or above everywhere. Like everything's always going your way. Like you're gonna come out on top. So I don't know. I'm hoping someone can, yeah.
Well, that's the thing that struck me. We were talking about this earlier. So on the one hand, and this is true, I've seen this in Salvatore's other novels. I feel like when it comes to magic, he's really trying to represent, like, it's clear that he's got the player's handbook or whatever open. He's like, ooh, darkness, fairy fire. That's how this spell works. It's okay. I've been told it's okay to have spoilers. There's a climactic scene in which Dritz casts the spell darkness on a dragon's head. Okay, so that his head is enshrouded in a sphere of darkness, right? And I went to go look at the rules. I'm like, can you do that? In first edition, I think you could cast it on an object. Salvatore reads like a player who's got a really nice DM. Like, yeah, okay, I'll let you get away with that. When it comes to combat, like Aaron was saying, I mean, you got people one-shotting frost giants. Like there's a lot about it that is not true to the mechanics of combat, but there's one fight in particular with the frost giant leader, Big Grin, that I feel like was trying to represent it, where you even have these descriptions that look like they're describing like a turn of combat. And that makes me think of the D&D movie, because towards the end of the D&D movie, there's a combat scene in which I think they really are literally trying to represent that. Like, here's the initiative order. Boom, 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 right? There's one place in here that I think it does it. Otherwise, the combat is very fast in the book. It's much different from combat in an RPG.
Absolutely. Like, they kill a dragon in just like 4 paragraphs, and I was like, oh, yeah. Okay.
Oh, hey.
Somebody rolled a natural 20, and the GM was nice and said the dragon is dead.
It's like, can I ink that sickle hanging from the ceiling? Okay, I don't see why you couldn't. Yeah.
Yeah, one thing I actually really did like was, being a professional dungeon master, I played Dungeons and Dragons all the time, like hours and hours every week, and I definitely feel like this is based on like the best version of D&D that you could possibly have as an experience around the table, because you were having players not just saying like, I shoot something with my bow, right? Like, they're trying to do clever things with their weapons and with the environment and with the monsters themselves. And so it does feel like someone is using the mechanics to generate narrative advantages, which translates into an awesome storytelling moment. And I could definitely see that riddled throughout the book. And so I was thinking about the mechanics as I was, reading through the combat and things like that. Like the scene, I think it's the same chapter where he fights Big Grin, where Dritz gets hit by a rock, like one of the giants throws a rock at him, and I'm like, oh, he missed his dex save, and that's why he got slammed by this boulder. And so it was very interesting just kind of having that parallel to the plot itself in my head.
Okay. And now we'll come back then. We've kind of talked about what we see about the mechanics, all the writing of the stories. So we kind of went through the pros and cons of using the different systems and that. And all that. So this book, as was mentioned by Chris, was, came out in 1988. The following year is when this book came out, which is the second edition Player's Handbook. Okay. So this is, as I was saying, there was really kind of a launch, and this is when they first started doing all their tie-in. Then, as you were mentioning, it was a couple of years later that they came out with the Forgotten Realms book. Now, this one, they did take a lot of things, because if you go right in here, we have artwork of Dritz.
Oh, cool.
And that's the first time he showed up as part of the official game. So this was just a couple of years after that. So it really started to influence how Dungeons and Dragons was played and the development of the Forgotten Realms world. Now, we're all gamers here, and I have a feeling most people are. So kind of in particular to the work of Salvatore, the work put forth in the Crystal Shard, the characters, because I can't help but notice this. There's 5 main characters in this party, 1 woman and 4 others. And I look on the screen and go, hey, look, guess what we got here? But how did...
Dibs on
Bruno.
Bruno.
Mari.
I can be catty free. I don't mind.
So how do you feel that the information, even if it was later you read it or you're just now getting into the game, how do you feel this book impacted the D&D or the fantasy and gaming community? And how has it played out since then? It's been, almost 40 years since it was published.
Well, I mean, the funny thing for me again is I only read this book recently. I am running a game right now as a gamer, okay, set in Icewind Dale. And I'm actually drawing lore on Icewind Dale from the novel. So I'm sharing things with my players. Like, well, of course, the barbarians invaded over 100 years ago. And, And so that's what I love about it. I think that's definitely a way to influence it. It's that ready-made, deep, deep world. I'm hearing an echo there. um, but Tolkien talks about fantasy worlds that a believable fantasy world has the internal consistency of reality, right? And it's that feeling of like, man, if I just scratch the surface, there is so much culture and history here. And I think that's why Forgotten Realms remains so popular, is because it gives people a ready-made, deep structure, right? That they can draw on without having to make all that stuff up themselves.
Well, and I think it's so deeply ingrained in all of it now that it's just common knowledge today. Anybody who's only been playing for the last 15, 20 years, or even since, right? My own children know about Dresden. They know these different things as we play, but it's just there. It's always been there for them. And it's always been there for a lot of us at this point, because it has been so deeply weaved through all of Dungeons and Dragons for all these years. It's you almost nowadays you almost can't believe there was a time without it.
I think for me the interesting thing is obviously D&D is kind of the lore is structured so that very specific races are playable races and very specific races are monsters. And you're supposed to kill the monsters with the playable races. Whereas in this book, right, we obviously have a drow character who is not a playable race for a very long time in the iteration of the game, suddenly becoming a main character and therefore is a player character in terms, in the game mechanic terms. And so I think we're seeing like a change, right? Like a desire for players to play with more than what's originally available with the mechanics, right? And so like there, for example, there's hints that one of the, I think it's one of the lies that Regis tells about how one of the orc tribes turned his back on the wizard and is planning on, double crossing them. And in that moment, there's just like a seed of like, oh, well, yeah, what if the orcs actually got along with the people of Icewind Dale, and maybe then they could become a playable race as well, right? So we're kind of seeing openings in the narrative for mechanics to be changed, because that makes for a very interesting story. And I can't imagine that, that doesn't automatically lead for, further versions of the game later down the line to open up other options for mechanics.
Mhm.
Yeah, as a
So,
very no, you go ahead, Chris.
I was just going to say, but for Salvatore, I do feel, again, especially writing in 1988, there's still this gravitational pull, right, back to there are evil races and there are good races,
Oh,
and the whole
absolutely.
thing, up to the 2014 Player's Handbook, it says the Drow are basically would be irredeemable, like they would be
Right.
completely written off as a race if it weren't for the one exception, right? So Dritz is the one exception that proves the rule. He's the one good Drow, and he's a guy in a matriarchal society, right? So I don't think it's without problems.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely.
Yeah, I mean, as a very
Right.
moderate gamer, I feel like, I don't feel like I'm one to like provide like a really big commentary on this, but I feel like I have noticed shades um of this book in more like modern RPGs. Like Skyrim is the one that comes to mind. I mean, that's been re-released a billion times by Bethesda, and it's been influential for me and my fantasy writing. But I mean, the dark elves are kind of looked down on in Skyrim, so I feel like there's like that parallel kind of between the Crystal Shard and Skyrim, where it's there's like this inherent racism between different races. But I mean, that's just a parallel that I've noticed in my very small way. But yeah, you guys are more the experts on this.
I think that's a very good point. It kind of leads into something else we had kind of talked about, and I'm going to bring in now. And that is the tropes that we see, since we're in fantasy, the tropes that we see in fantasy. And here we have a book from 1988 that, as Chris has pointed out, there's some very definite tropes being used. And as Maury has pointed out, currently those are in change. You, Aaron, point out they are in change. What are some of those tropes and maybe storylines and everything that we see Salvatore using in the Crystal Shard that are right in line then, maybe more problematic now? that we might, people might want to take a look and read as a learning instruction for their own writing?
Mm.
Well, just speaking for myself, I felt like a lot of the characters in this book were kind of just copy paste like races and classes, if I'm being honest. Where it's like, oh, the dwarf is stubborn and knows how to build a really sick hammer. Okay, yeah, like we've seen that. I wish the characters had a little bit more depth, in my opinion, because I feel like I would have become more attached to them. But like, they just felt like kind of standard, races and classes of, you're the dark elf ranger, so you can do this and that, but there wasn't. But that's just how that's just my experience with the book. I'm sure if a lot of people have had some much more tremendous experiences with the characters, but for me it kind of fell flat because I feel like I wanted something different.
Mhm. Yeah, I felt like Wolfgar is the one character who's actually allowed kind of a story arc. Like he's allowed to develop and
Mhm.
change. And and maybe it is because D&D works in terms of races and classes, and traditionally those are associated with innate characteristics. You are an X, right?
Mhm.
That those other characters, yeah, like Brunor is kind of just a comic character. I mean, he gets his nurturing moments, which is cool. Um, but and what is Regis? So like what like Regis is this halfling who's got a magic pendant. And I kept thinking about that. Like, is he a rogue? Does he do anything else besides have a magic pendant? Like, is that his class? Like pendant guy? Like, what is
All
his?
right.
Yeah,
Yeah, I
what would
mean,
that make him?
I tried to Google it and I couldn't find any definitive answer, to be honest. But it does feel like he does have some sort of charisma, right? He's some sort of spokesperson, politician who
Yeah,
also happens to be a thief. So
right.
high dex, high charisma. Maybe
A
that's
rogue.
about it.
Yeah, it's a rogue.
That's the thing that struck me though too is that even though it is tie-in fiction to D&D, we actually get very little of the core sort of structure of D&D, which is an adventure party having adventures together. We get a lot of pairings. We get Dritz and Wolfgar.
Mhm.
In some ways, it's almost like the backstory for the formation of a party. Because by the end of the novel, it's like, okay, we have four people that are going to get together and go have an adventure together. But otherwise, they split the party a lot, right? Like, or the party is split by the author. Like the characters are in lots of different places.
Which
The
was
tropes I noticed.
interesting. Oh, I was just gonna say, like, just based on what you said about Wolfgar, it seemed to me like Wolfgar was the only one that was like leveling in terms of
Yeah,
mechanics, right? Whereas everyone else was already like top
oh,
level.
it's just
Maybe Dritz got like a cooler weapon at some point, right? And so like that was his mechanical advantage or improvement in the course of the game. But you're right, Wolfgar was the only one that was like really going through like the story of development.
It's like
yeah.
Wolfgar
Uh,
came to the party late, but he brought the Cheetos, so everybody's like, "Oh, come on in. We'll get you leveled up and we'll get you sorted out."
He's
well,
the one that brought in the Mountain Dew.
That's right.
yes,
That's right.
the other tropiness I'm curious and people's thoughts about are just the obviously heavy indebtedness to Tolkien, um, even to the names of things like the crystal tower that the evil wizard raises is called Crishal Tirith. So Crishal is just like crystal with one letter changed. I don't think he understood Elvish. The Tirith in Tolkien doesn't mean tower; it means guard, or like what Minas means tower, right? But just all we get two different stories of dwarves who are driven from their ancestral homes, right, by dragons or shadow creatures because they delved too deep. And I guess the question I have is, if you're a 14-year-old boy in 1988, do you care? Like, like, if you've read Lord of the Rings and you see that, do you care? Does that seem derivative, or is it actually in some ways kind of reassuring? Like, oh yeah, like that. I like those kinds of stories, right? Or
Mhm.
I know that story, right?
Well, for me, I think as a 14-year-old boy, I probably would have gotten way more into the Crystal Shard than I would the Lord of the
Mhm.
Rings, because at the time I didn't have the
Yeah.
patience to
Oh,
tolerate the
oh,
Lord of the Rings
oh, yeah,
pace. Yeah,
yeah,
but the Crystal Shard is like it's going
yeah.
at like 100 miles an hour, and
Right.
I probably would have liked it more.
Sure.
Totally.
I think that's kind of part of the reason why tie-in fiction relies so heavily on tropes is because it does drag in new people into the world quite quickly, and so it's very accessible. Because the tropes just help you immediately gather information.
But I would say as a strength, Salvatore's writing, I really like his descriptive writing, and I think he's really good at it. I think he's most of the time. Sometimes he gets very telly when he has like a moral that he wants to give you, like traditions get people into trouble, or we need to have unity. But most of the time he shows rather than tells, and but he's not Tolkien level, like, let me tell you how wet the gravel was on the left side of the path. Because you might be worried. You don't
Tolkien's
know the
writing is so
books.
beautiful, though. I don't know.
Kind of summarizing what's been said here, one of the things that we're looking at is the story arcs for the characters. There's really only one in here. And I think that kind of ties in, like I was saying before, is this was originally written to be Wulfgar's story. So I think that's the reason why later on people became understanding that it was a whole different character. And in fact, some of the things like you're mentioning, the next two books are the Streams of Silver and then the Halfling's Gem. So it actually does go into the other characters about their backgrounds, Mithril Hall, and also, about our rogue, our thief in the party. So that
And
it
it's
kind of goes
because
into
of
some of those.
those
So we have
books.
those.
It's because of those books I dibs to Bruno when we were divvying it up.
It brings in the other characters much more fuller, and like we've said, I think it's because the audience said, "No, here's the one we want to know about." So there is one thing that I found that nobody mentioned. That is something that, as I've moved forward as a writer, that nowadays is very much kind of frowned upon in writing style. What do you think of the head hopping that Salvatore uses as a third person, very shallow, omniscient storyteller?
Sure. I noticed that quite a bit. And that happened so much during the battle scenes where it was like we'd have like this much from Dritz, and then all of a sudden we're flung, hundreds of miles away off of the top of the mountain down into the battlefield into like the councilman's head. And I was like, wow, this feels very much like narrative whiplash. It was very cool. I will say I haven't read a book like that in a very long time. And so it was interesting to like see that happen. But you're right, like that is not a I would say a strategy that many writers use, especially not today.
I will admit that in some of the writing groups that I have been involved with in symposiums and that, they actually say, don't do it, period. Don't head hop, don't go shallow omniscient. You pick a character and really delve into them type of thing. But I interrupted you, Aaron.
No, you're good. I mean, all I said is I didn't really mind it. I feel like there was enough separation between the different sections where I knew whose head I was in now. And I think an author who does this tremendously is George R. R. Martin. He's got so many characters that we're following through Game of Thrones. And, every chapter he makes sure to like indicate this is who we're following, I did have an instance in The Legend of where I had hopped for like half a chapter once because there's a part where a character goes off and has this really special moment to kind of like wrap a bow on an instance he had when he was younger. And my editor was like, "You should get rid of it." And I thought about it, and I was like, "No, I'm keeping it. Like, this is a special scene that helps us connect with this character a little bit more." So I don't know. Like I have definitely experienced that where it's like, no, one perspective, whole book, but I don't mind it. I think the head hopping is fine as long as you're like conscious and consistent about it, but that's just one guy's opinion.
Yeah, and just clarity of the
Yeah.
switch, right? Yeah.
Totally.
I was surprised when I discovered that it was going to be an omniscient point of view, because for the first few pages were just from Kessel's perspective, right? And I thought that was a really interesting strategy. This guy ultimately is going to become the villain. He actually gets presented sort of sympathetically to begin with, right? That gets thrown out the window later, and I think eventually he just becomes very much a comic villain, right? But I actually noticed that, like, oh, I'm inside someone else's head now. Oh, okay, I didn't see that coming. And I would say, like with Martin, that's an excellent point. But I forget which of the books in the series, maybe the third one, where he's changing perspectives every chapter, and sometimes it's like totally non-central characters, like, oh, this is from the perspective of the stable boy, and I think he decided that was too much because I noticed in the later book, in the book after that, it's like, okay, we're going to calm it down and just have like 6 main characters that we kind of rotate among.
Now, Now, I will admit, I didn't think this is as bad as if you've read Dune. Uh, that,
Oh,
that is a third-person omniscient where you're just everywhere all at once.
Oh yeah.
But so what we're kind of telling to our people that are listening on this is, if you're going to use this type of strategy, make sure you provided a clarity so that people can follow the story and have a reason for doing it. Sound good?
mhm.
Okay. So we were talking about some of the different things going on with the tropes being used, but and some of the pros and the cons in there. Now there's been mention a little bit about how the races have changed over time in the D&D world. And we mentioned earlier on that this was really written at a time when it was these are for boys to be playing the games. And we do see that has changed drastically over time. So kind of comparing the book, maybe some of your current day experiences, where do you see like maybe the racial roles, the gender roles, or if you're playing the different classes and so forth, some of the changes that you've seen from the time that this book was written and what's presented here to current day. Oh, I stumped everybody.
I'm like waiting for someone smarter to speak up.
Well, I mean,
Well,
orc is now a playable race, so
Yeah,
that's
I mean,
that's one that I love playing.
exactly. And so I guess one of the things that happened with me was I decided to write this old school fantasy, but my kind of twist was, okay, all the different fantasy races are going to have their own flying creatures for their own air forces. And so, the humans would ride griffins, the orcs would ride wyverns, the elves ride pegasi, different things, right? But I ended up really enjoying the orcs a lot, so I ended up like making one of the orcs a really central character who is just so vital for the whole series. He ended up being on the front cover of the second book. And so when I was explaining to people, oh, it's like very old school fantasy, like it brings back a lot of that nostalgia. But also I've got an orc that's like a main character. So like, there's this dynamic which newer players nowadays are like, oh, that's so awesome, that's so great, that'd be so much fun. That's kind of a odd dynamic with the nostalgic vibe, but then also one of these classically horror like monster characters being actually not a bad guy.
yeah.
And so that's been an interesting thing that I've seen as people have been reading my books, because the gaming has changed over time, right?
Mhm. It is interesting, especially because this is tied to gaming. And as in a lot of fan communities, there are people that sort of set themselves up as gatekeepers and protectors of the canon or protectors of the lore. So as part of my book project, I interviewed people of color who play D&D to ask them about their perceptions of fantasy races. And I talked to players who tried to play a good drow and were flat out told by their DM that they couldn't do that. Okay, so there were people on the flip side that consciously were playing drow or orcs contrary to type to challenge those sorts of characterizations. And there were people. I mean, I interviewed a person who another character played by a white man killed her. She called it drow descendant character, kind of like a half drow, who she had never played as evil. Killed her character on like the second session on the grounds that quote she was evil, right? And she wasn't, right? He was just being racist. So yeah, I do think it interesting, and the way that Wizards of the Coast has approached some of this is to play dueling canons. So I don't know if you're aware of this, but they issued a statement a few years ago to say, well, actually, this old stuff is no longer canon. And what is canon on the Drow is our most recently published materials. And understandably, I imagine a lot of players aren't going with that because they're like, wait a minute, that isn't the way canons work. That means usually it means the old stuff is more correct, right? So I do think some of those stereotypes have died really hard. I think with the Drow in particular, though, and I talk to people, I'd say, well, are there any particular fantasy races you think reflect real world racial bias? And a lot of people would say Drow, 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 but then they'd say, but they're sexy and they're cool. and I like them. So there's that allure. I think this particular Baldur's Gate 3, and more recently, just the sexualization of the drow. People like them, right? They have this transgressive kind of glee about them. And in that game, there basically you have the options of playing an evil drow or a good drow. So there's still that, again, that gravity of wanting to kind of retain some sense of that, right?
Yeah. So someone who came into D&D in 5th edition, like I'm the baby here, but my experience with D&D is that, when people select like a race and a class, it's like entirely just based on the abilities of those races and classes. It's not necessarily like whether one is good or evil. So, the friends that I've had who have played D&D, it's just like a free for all of whatever you would like this character to be. And I think that's beautiful, because I mean, that's the reason we play these games to begin with, right? It's escapism. To get to like put yourself in someone else's shoes. I think that's awesome. Like you can make it whatever you want to be. If you want to play this like Boy Scout of a drow who's just like does everything right all the time, that's great. Lawful good, that's freaking awesome. So I feel like that's definitely become really embraced, at least in my circle of like friends who game. But I can imagine there's still a lot of purists out there who want to follow the old school ways, and I don't know, to me it's like, have fun, do it the way you want to do it, and
Yeah.
that's the most meaningful experience you can have with it.
Yeah. I don't want to put Madi on the spot, but I am curious as a woman reading this book, what it's like. Again, we've talked about there's one female character, Catti, who is sort of Brunor's foster daughter. And the only other women in the book are a enslaved harem of basically sex slaves that the evil wizard keeps in his tower, who are kind of like zombies,
But we also have like the women and children of both the fishermen, and then the women and children of the barbarians, both of whom are just props in the story, right? They're just kind of shuffled around the board, running away from different groups of, people that are trying to kill them, and they're obviously not serving any function except to make the heroes mad that they're being killed. But you're right, like there's not a lot of women in the book besides, I would say, either they're essentially props for the men to play with in this story, which is interesting. So you're right, like I was a little disappointed about that, but I also do realize that, given the target audience for a book like this, like it makes sense, but it still doesn't make me feel good that like sexual violence is like part of the narrative of what a woman in this world is just going to be like. So I would prefer that weren't in it, but maybe that's, again, a fantasy trope that people are trying to gravitate toward in a fantasy setting, because certainly it does exist in the Conan Barbarian, esque type of fantasy anyway.
So kind of speaking more on a generic term for role-playing games, women and girls didn't really get involved in role-playing games for about another 10 years. And it was not because of D&D, but because of Vampire the Masquerade. That really kind of brought them into tabletop gaming. And I can attest, because I do some professional dungeon work also, and work with several different conventions around. There are a lot more girls and women playing now than there was 10, 15, 20 years ago. Or back in the time when this book was written, we had a group of like 40 people, and there was one girl in our gaming group. So it has really changed over time, which I think is very much says a lot. And this is not the only book that touches on those different things, but I think it's one that kind of starts it off really well. So we're coming up into the last few minutes of our hour together. So what I wanted to do is kind of throw out and give each of you a chance to tell again any final comments you have about our discussion. Also, please tell us where we can find you and where you find your work. And then I will kind of wrap up about some future announcements, what's coming up, and tell you about a little bit about myself and where you can find me. So we started from the top last time. So this time we'll start down the bottom with Zed.
Yeah, sure.
That's my
I love that.
Europeanness coming out.
Yeah, I was gonna say, I love that we used another one. Let's throw them all in there, shuffle them in. Yeah, so obviously ZSD Monty is very hard to spell, but I write a lot of fantasy books, and so if you are interested in these kind of that's kind of old school, kind of gives you some nostalgic feels with fantasy, but also has a lot of girls who are just awesome and kick butt. Definitely come and check out some of my books. And a great way to do that is I actually give away 7 free fantasy stories about different characters that you actually meet in my Stone and Sky trilogy. And it's kind of like gathering your party. I get a lot of people who read the free preludes and then they go read the books, and it was like, oh my gosh, it was like finding an old friend. I love it. So if you're interested in that at all, it's totally free, and you can find those at freefantasyfiction.com. Freefantasyfiction.com is way easier to spell than zsdiamante.com, but they're attached, so you'll be able to find all the other things too.
Okay, we'll move up to Mari.
Okay. So you can find me at my website, MartyMurdoch.com, which has all of my fiction and gaming stuff that I am working on. I'm also recruiting for a D&D game as a professional dungeon master. I am running a Humblewood mashup of Wild Beyond the Witchlight, which will be happening this fall. So if you're interested in playing with me as a GM, look for me at dungeonmasterdirect.com and talk to Dax for me about it, and we'll try to get you signed up. That'd be really fun to play with you.
Chris.
So I just want to say, first of all, what a great pleasure and privilege it's been to speak with everybody. I am not a creative writer; I am an uncreative. But people hopefully can get my book again by the end of the year through McFarland. That's McFarland. It's called Race and Monstrosity in Dungeons and Dragons. It's actually available now for pre-order. So if you went to the McFarland website and looked for Race and Monstrosity in Dungeons and Dragons, you could actually get your foot in the door to get a copy of that book once it comes out. But it's been a real pleasure to hear from the people that actually create these kinds of stories.
It's really good. I read it already. It's great.
So yeah, I want to echo what Chris said. This has been a delight. I've loved chatting with you guys. It's been awesome. But so my name's Aaron N. Hall. AaronNHall.com. That's where you'll find what I'm doing. Go buy The Legend of It's a fantasy comedy inspired by the D&D universe. It became about because of a campaign I had with me and my close friends, and it's been getting amazing reviews. If you like Adventure Time, Princess Bride, D&D, you're gonna freaking love this book. But if you go sign up for the Insiders Guild on my website, the newsletter, you will get a free book emailed right to your inbox called I'm Sorry, Here's a Plasma Rifle, a collection of short stories, poems, and pastry recipes. And it's free, and it's super fun. So go get it.
Okay, and I'm Dan Yoakum. I work with LTUE as the gaming track coordinator, so I put together the panels for the gaming track for them. I'm also the panel coordinator for some other events. If you want to meet me in person in a couple weeks, I will be at the SaltCon events, their big spring events, because I have panels going on up there. I am a professional reviewer of tabletop games, books, and movies, and you can find my work at Guildmaster Gaming and other sites that decide to actually pay me money to write for them. So please join us again. We've had a lot of fun talking about the Crystal Shard and how it's impacted us as gamers and writers and how it can possibly help you. Now, next month, June, the book is going to be Howl's Moving Castle. Another really fun read, and I can see people nodding their heads going, oh yeah, this is a good one. So come back then. There's going to be probably a whole new lineup because I know I won't be available, and I don't know about who Ryan Boucher is trying to get for that, but that will be towards the latter half of the month of June, usually just like this one, within about the last week. So thank you everyone for joining us at LTUE's Book Club. Please find a good book, read it, and share it with a friend.